They erased it, a secret healthier than kale, packed with nutrition, calcium, and more.
In the shadowed corners of American agricultural history lies a story that has been deliberately forgotten, buried beneath the weight of industrial farming and corporate agriculture. There exists a tree, resilient and impossibly productive, that once fed entire communities across the American South and Midwest. This tree could survive droughts that killed traditional crops, required minimal care after initial planting, and delivered more nutritional value than the spinach and kale that modern health enthusiasts obsess over today. Yet somewhere between the Great Depression and the Industrial Agricultural Revolution, this botanical marvel vanished from our collective memory, replaced by annual crops that demanded more water, more chemicals, and more labor. This is the story of what we lost, why it disappeared, and what one tree could teach us about the mistakes we made in choosing convenience over wisdom. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of what locals simply called the miracle tree, casting dappled shadows across the red clay soil of rural Georgia in 1923. Families who lived along the plantation borders had perfected the art of knowing when the leaves would reach their peak nutritional value, timing their harvests to the spring season when the tender shoots emerged with an intensity that suggested almost supernatural vigor. The tree, known scientifically as a species that thrived in conditions where traditional crops withered and died, had become so integrated into southern agricultural life that its origins had been nearly forgotten by the people who depended on it most. What made this tree particularly valuable was not merely its ability to survive where other plants failed, but its remarkable productivity that seemed to defy the laws of agricultural scarcity. A single mature tree, left untended for decades, could continue producing nutrient-dense foliage that surpassed the nutritional profiles of carefully cultivated spinach fields that required constant irrigation, fertilization, and pest management. The African American communities and sharecroppers who worked the plantations recognized something in these trees that the landowners, preoccupied with cotton and tobacco, seemed to overlook. They understood that these were not merely decorative plants or emergency food sources, but rather a sophisticated food system that had been proven across centuries and continents. The leaves contained iron, calcium, and proteins in concentrations that seemed almost impossible for a plant grown in the difficult conditions of American plantation lands. Recipes passed down through generations detailed methods of preparing the leaves, from simple boiling to complex preservation techniques that allowed families to maintain nutrition through the harsh winter months when fresh vegetables disappeared from the landscape. The tree represented a form of agricultural knowledge that existed outside the formal systems of agricultural science and university extension programs that were beginning to shape American farming in the early 20th century. This knowledge belonged to the people, handed from mother to daughter, from elder to youth, in spaces where formal education had never reached and systems of power had never intended to penetrate. The productivity of a single tree could sustain a family's nutritional needs for months, making it an invaluable insurance policy against the unpredictable droughts and crop failures that characterized agricultural life in the American South. Yet even as these trees flourished in backyards and on the margins of plantation lands, a different kind of agricultural system was being constructed, one that would require the abandonment of such decentralized, family-based food production in favor of centralized, industrial, and ultimately dependent relationships between farmers and the corporations that supplied their seeds and chemicals. The transition from the 19th century into the 20th century marked a decisive break in American agricultural practice, a moment when the accumulated knowledge of countless generations began to be systematically discarded in favor of new methodologies, based on chemistry, mechanization, and the ideology of progress. Agricultural extension agents, typically educated in state universities and backed by the growing chemical industries, arrived in rural communities with a singular message. Modern farming required modern methods, and the old ways, regardless of their proven effectiveness, represented an impediment to advancement. The hardy trees that had sustained families and communities were not merely ignored in this new paradigm. They were actively discouraged. They did not fit into the infrastructure being constructed around monoculture and annual crops. They could not be easily mechanized. Their harvest could not be industrialized in the way that wheat, corn, and cotton could be processed through massive mechanical systems. More significantly, they presented a profound threat to the emerging business model of agricultural production, which depended on farmers purchasing seed annually, adopting new chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and becoming locked into cycles of debt and dependency. The trees, by contrast, embodied self-sufficiency. Plant them once, and they would produce for 2 decades or longer, without requiring yearly purchases of seed or escalating inputs of chemical management. This contradiction between what worked and what was profitable became the defining tension of 20th century American agriculture. The Great Depression, which devastated rural America and forced millions from agricultural life, occurred not because sustainable farming systems had failed, but because the new industrial system had created conditions of such precarity that any economic shock would collapse the entire structure. Yet rather than recognizing this failure and returning to more resilient practices, the subsequent decades of agricultural policy doubled down on industrial methods. Government programs encouraged consolidation and mechanization. Land-grant universities, which had once transmitted practical knowledge to rural communities, became increasingly oriented toward serving industrial agriculture. The hardy trees continued to exist in a few old gardens, maintained by elderly people who remembered the old ways, but they were no longer planted by new generations. The knowledge of how to use them, how to recognize when they were ready to harvest, how to prepare and preserve their nutritious leaves, began its slow dissolution into obscurity. Young people leaving the farms for cities encountered a food system already constructed, already specialized, where food came from distant places, and the role of the consumer was passive acceptance rather than active participation in its production. By the middle of the 20th century, the transformation was nearly complete. The hardy trees had become so invisible that most Americans had no knowledge of their existence, and the younger generation of farmers had been educated in systems that never mentioned them. Agricultural schools taught crop rotation based on annual crops, soil management based on chemical inputs, and disease and pest management based on pesticide applications. The alternative system, which worked with ecological principles rather than against them, which built soil fertility rather than depleting it, which required less external input rather than more, was simply erased from the curricula. Yet the tree did not disappear entirely. It persisted in forgotten corners of the rural South, in gardens maintained by elderly women who had no formal education but possessed generations of practical knowledge. Agricultural historians who would later uncover fragments of this lost history found references to the tree in old documents, in plantation records kept by observers, in folk tales and traditional knowledge that had survived in communities that the modern agricultural establishment had written off as backward and ignorant. What emerged from these fragments was a picture of a sophisticated food system that had been abandoned not because it failed, but because it could not be monetized through the emerging structures of industrial capitalism. The tree, in its very existence and productivity, represented a form of abundance that did not require debt, did not create dependency, and could not generate profit margins for corporations. The soil where these trees grew did not require chemical fertilization because their root systems worked with mycorrhizal networks to extract and concentrate nutrients. The leaves did not require pesticides because the tree's own chemistry and the ecosystem it supported created conditions where pests did not proliferate in damaging numbers. The harvest was not seasonal, but distributed throughout the growing season, providing not the feast or famine cycle of annual crops, but a steady, reliable source of nutrition. This consistency, which should have been celebrated, became a liability in a system built on scarcity, seasonality, and the need for storage, processing, and transportation infrastructure. A food system based on abundance did not require the complex machinery that generated wealth for the agribusiness corporations. A farmer with hardy trees producing steady nutrition did not need to borrow money, did not need to purchase inputs, and did not need the services of the bank and the seed company that had become central to American rural life. The rediscovery of the hardy tree in contemporary times arrived almost by accident, through the back door of nutritional science rather than through the front door of agricultural practice. Researchers investigating plant-based sources of iron, calcium, and protein for populations in developing nations began encountering references to this tree in historical documents and in the traditional knowledge of communities where it had never been abandoned. They conducted nutritional analyses and found results that seemed to contradict the assumptions that had guided nutritional science for decades. The tree, when properly cultivated and harvested, delivered nutritional concentrations that rivaled or exceeded the most celebrated contemporary superfoods. Yet when scientific researchers attempted to trace the history of the tree in American agriculture, they encountered a profound silence. The Agricultural Extension Services had no records. The university agricultural programs had no institutional knowledge. The seed companies had no varieties in their catalogs. The tree existed in American history, yet it had been so thoroughly expunged from American agricultural memory that its recovery required the work of historical archaeologists examining old plantation records and oral historians, interviewing elderly people who remembered their grandmothers preparing the leaves in specific ways tied to seasons and lunar cycles. What emerged was a portrait of deliberate forgetting. The suppression of the tree was not an accident of history, but a consequence of structural forces that actively eliminated agricultural practices that did not fit into the emerging industrial system. Textbooks were written without mention of it. Seed catalogs simply did not include it. Young farmers were trained in systems that had no place for it. By the time sufficient doubt had arisen about the wisdom of industrial agriculture, the knowledge of how to cultivate and use the tree had almost entirely disappeared from American culture. What remained was scattered, held in the memory of the oldest generation, documented in fragments of written records, and preserved in the oral traditions of communities that had resisted the complete assimilation into industrial food systems. Today, the rediscovery of the hardy tree represents something far more significant than the mere resurrection of a forgotten crop. It represents an opportunity to question the fundamental assumptions that guided the agricultural transformation of the 20th century. The tree stands as a living refutation of the idea that progress is unidirectional, that newer is always better, and that the choices made by the agricultural establishment were inevitable rather than contingent. The nutritional data demonstrates that communities in the American South once had access to food sources that exceeded what modern nutritional science considers optimal. The ecological data demonstrates that these food systems built soil rather than depleting it, supported complex ecosystems rather than destroying them, and created conditions of abundance rather than scarcity. The economic data demonstrates that families could sustain themselves with minimal external inputs, producing most of what they needed within their own properties. The human data, extracted from historical records and the testimony of elderly people who remember the old ways, demonstrates that people understood how to live with this abundance, how to harvest it without depleting it, and how to share it within their communities. The deliberate forgetting of the tree was not an innocent mistake, but a choice made by people with power to organize the world in ways that served their interests. When the tree resurfaced as a subject of scientific attention in the late 20th century, seed companies began to recognize a market opportunity. What had been abandoned as insufficiently profitable suddenly became interesting when packaged as an exotic superfood for wealthy, health-conscious consumers. Yet there exists a profound irony in this rediscovery. The communities who once cultivated the tree as an ordinary part of their food system, taking its abundance for granted, cannot afford the prices that the commodified version commands in contemporary health food markets. The tree that once represented a form of food sovereignty, a way of feeding oneself and one's community without external dependency, now becomes available primarily to those with sufficient wealth to purchase the fashionable nutritional products sold by corporations that have only recently acknowledged its existence. The true lesson of the hardy tree lies not in its resurrection as a trendy superfood, but in the recognition of what was lost when we abandoned it, what we might have learned from it, and what might be possible if we made different choices about the relationships between food production, ecological integrity, and human community. The tree survives, persisting in some forgotten gardens, waiting for a generation willing to plant it not for profit, but for the simple, revolutionary act of feeding itself.